I have a question for Art. One of the things that is fascinating is whether the testis of an XX male is secreting the same androgens during the organizational period as an XY male. So I'm wondering if you've had a chance to gonadectomize animals at birth and see if all of the interesting differences that you see materialize then.
We know for sure that the testes are not the same. So an XX animal does not make sperm. You need the rest of the Y chromosome besides S or Y to make sperm. And so the testes are small. And we haven't measured hormone levels early in life, and we haven't gonadectomized them around the time of birth. They're still quite masculine in a lot of things. There are a lot of things where we measure them and they're similar. The two groups, XX and XY males, are similar and different from females.
Hi, my name's Kat, and I'm a senior at Stanford. I have a question for Dr. Joel. You mentioned that in response to exposure to violence, males were diagnosed more with PTSD than females. And I was wondering if you could speak to how that could relate to how PTSD is diagnosed, and if it could be measured based on a more male model of PTSD.
PTSD actually is typically more diagnosed in women than in men, so this is actually a surprising finding that it didn't affect the females, it only affected didn't affect the girls, but it affected the boys.
Along the same lines of how diagnosis might affect, the criteria for diagnosis might affect who gets diagnosed, I was wondering whether that might have affected the autism diagnosis. And then for all of you, I'm curious how much of the data that you have comes from non-European or non-European American populations.
In terms of classification, it goes back also to the PTSD question. With the DSM-5 coming up in June, it's going to be published in in May. There's been a focus recently on making it a little bit more age sensitive. So the hope is maybe in the next version it will be more maybe sex sensitive in terms of with regard to the different questions and maybe threshold for different disorders. So that might apply for like PTSD, depression. Maybe for depression you need maybe less than 5 criteria to be able to diagnose it in males compared to females. For autism, as I mentioned, we've probably been missing a lot of girls or females with high-functioning autism compared to boys because they might have some more deficits or deficits are a little bit less subtle to be able to identify compared to females. So the field, as I mentioned, is moving more toward like thinking about how we can identify these individuals a little bit more accurately and not missing them clinically, but also in the research studies.
So I'm going to follow up on that really quickly too and just ask part of the gender bias. You're saying that they have to have more symptoms before you see them? Is that what you're saying? Because it seems to me because people expect to see boys, they may misdiagnose the girls.
Yeah, it's not misdiagnosis. We probably are missing the girls because if you think about girls that are, like it or not, they are a little bit more social than boys. So for them to drop the threshold where it's going to become the focus of clinical attention, they will need a little bit more compared to boys, where boys to begin with are not the most social creatures. So that's why if they fall a little bit, we'll identify them, in contrast to girls where they are more social to begin with, so they might need a little bit more of a drift or a drop for us to identify them.
Go ahead. Okay. So in terms of something like Alzheimer's disease, I've often worried about whether there are detection biases that are gender-based. And for example, to the extent that memory tests are used to detect mild cognitive impairment or dementia, to the extent that they're based on verbal memory tasks where women often will do better than men, then the bias will be to detect men earlier compared to women. And so the detection bias might go in that direction. Ultimately, it won't make any difference, but in terms of early diagnosis, which then affects prevalence estimates, then there could be a bias there. The other big bias has to do with education, because the tests that are used to detect cognitive dysfunction are the kind of things that people are exposed to in school, and particularly in populations where there's a lot of illiteracy. Trying to copy an interlocking pentagon figure is a lot different there than it is for someone that's used to drawing and used to holding a pencil and so forth. And to the extent that educational biases are gender related, then that would also end up being a detection bias relevant to something like Alzheimer's disease. So I think the answer to your question is that there are a lot of biases in diagnosis. Some of them are recognized and some of these we pretend aren't there but really are there. Your other question was how much research is done in other parts of the world, and that sort of depends on which particular research question. But in terms of looking at prevalence and incidence for disorders like Alzheimer's disease, those studies have been done in a lot of places.
I mean, there are basically two questions here with gender differences in autism. The one is basically, are they less diagnosed or do they come less to the attention of the services? And the other one would be, are the symptoms of autism differently distributed in the males versus females? If you look at the population-based studies, they are in a certain way slightly contradictory to some of what we see in the diagnosis. So there's no simple interpretation, let's say, like this, but the data I showed, for example, for the protective effect, apply to both types of models if you basically use a more clinical-based population or whether you measure them basically quantitatively in the population. So, concerning the question of the different populations, I mean, in our studies here in California, it's pretty representative of the people in California because we try to get a population-based representation of our twin pairs, so it's reasonably representative. There are many studies, however, going on now in countries outside Europe, and I think in Autism Speaks has done an excellent job in really promoting studies outside the Western world, and there are many, many studies coming out and will be more and more coming about. There are large studies going on in Mexico now, there are studies starting to go on in Kenya, and then there are lots of different countries basically where there are studies will be coming out fairly soon, I think.
I think model the 4, what was it, 4?
4 core genotypes.
Yeah, I think it's very important because it emphasizes that sex is not a unitary thing, that it has different levels and that they have this complex interaction, and I think it really demonstrates it nicely. And I wonder if you wanted to comment more about this, the different levels and how they interact and the idea of compensation.
Actually, I have a... So, well, I think we're just barely beginning to understand this, that there's this kind of compensation. Another way of thinking about that is that, at least the way I used to think about sex differences, and I think a lot of us did, was that we thought of the male biasing factors all acting to make the male different from the female, and the female biasing factors making the female different from the male, and that they were adaptive. That is, there's, for the male, having a penis is adaptive if he wants to pass his genes on to the next generation. For the female, having large breasts is adaptive if she wants to feed the child. So we all thought of these as being kind of reproductively adaptive phenotypes. But there are all sorts of sex differences that are also adaptive, but we never thought of like the activational effects of hormones acting against the organizational effects of the hormones, because at least for me, I was thinking about them all being kind of adaptive and making the sexes different. But now, especially thinking about X activation, it's very paradoxical to call X activation a sexually differentiating event. It does make female cells different from male, but it's a reaction to another sex difference, which is that the female cell starts out with 2 X chromosomes and the male only has 1, and that creates all sorts of problems in the balance of gene dosage in the genome. That is, the X genes are out of balance in one sex relative to the other because of the double dose in females and the single dose in males. And so the adaptation here is to shut down one X chromosome to make the doses more equivalent. And this doesn't happen, for example, in birds, but it happens in mammals. And so one sex difference evolved to kind of turn off another sex difference that was, in a sense, a problem that the sex was stuck with, okay? But yet it is a sex difference. I think it should be, to me, it's a bit emancipating to begin to think of the expression of exist as a sex determining event or sexual differentiating event, because there might be things that exists is doing in the female cell once it gets turned on that have nothing to do with dosage compensation. And I don't know anybody who asked that question. Probably there were people, but they weren't publishing about it, as far as I know. I'd be happy to be corrected on that. So, yeah.
I want to add to this that De Vries, I think, was the one that studied this most, but in the brain you can also see examples for this. So it continues also in the brain, and there are systems in the brain that, again, are acting to compensate for sex differences in hormonal levels, for example. So you can have huge differences in the brain that eliminate sex differences in behavior, for example, in parenting behavior. So I think goes again and again. We always take sex differences as creating more and more differences, and sometimes actually acting to compensate for previous or earlier differences.
And I would be remiss not to mention Herta Fries, who wrote about the compensation before I did, and he pointed this out about, especially in parental behavior, et cetera, a decade ago.
My question is for Dr. Henderson. You mentioned a connection between midlife depression and Alzheimer's, and I'm wondering if you're seeing any differences for especially women who were successfully treating their depression with, say, behavioral modifications like exercise or counseling or medications, and the different rates that they might have with Alzheimer's.
So that's a really important question, and I don't think it's been answered by anyone. So the question is, to the extent that this association is there, to what extent is it causal, or causal in the sense that it's interfacing with some pathway that is, in essence, promoting an earlier manifestation of the development of the disease. And if so, then that means this would be a very important thing to detect early by physicians, by whomever, and treat early, because that would then have major consequences later in life. So I think the current belief is that treatment probably will reduce risk later on, but the mechanism by which depression is associated with Alzheimer's disease is controversial, and the data aren't there to really answer the important question that you're raising.
The question of variability within each gender or each sex. So I'm curious, because you're all focusing on sex differences, except I think Daphna raised the question of also incredible variability that one could focus on within each sex. So can each of you just briefly comment on how much variability there was between males and females compared to the differences?
And from an autism point of view, to begin with, the disorder is very, 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 very heterogeneous in terms of with regard to different manifestation, in terms of clinically. So, the fact that in males with autism, we see like a wide range of presentations. The same thing, we see it in a clinical setting, with females. So I think probably this is like a clinical point of view, not from a scientific point of view, but I think definitely there is a very clear heterogeneity in the presentation in male and females with autism. So I don't know if you want to add something.
I agree. I mean, the variation is huge in both sexes.
So for Alzheimer's disease, I would say the differences are much smaller than the similarities. And the importance of the differences is not so much that there are differences, but to what extent are there clues or hints there that might provide insights into pathogenesis, that might provide insights into treatment approaches. And it would be a mistake to say that there are dramatic differences or even important clinical distinctions between men and women.
we've thought a lot about variability, and we've looked in our mice, for example, to see whether XX are more variable than XY, or whether males are more variable than females. In the animal, one reason why females are avoided in studying animals is that people all assume that the females are more variable. So if you're interested in, let's say, how the heart functions and you want to reduce your variability, some people choose to study males because they're afraid of the variability of the estrus cycle, right? Jeff Mogul published a really nice paper where they looked at thousands of mice. He studies pain and sex differences in pain. And he showed that over many studies, actually, the females were no more variable than the males. We didn't see any patterns that we could come out and make a conclusion. We thought we saw some patterns, but then they went away as we studied it more. That is, in our XX more variable than XY. But in inbred mice, you're already reducing a lot of variability. So it's a really interesting question. Daphna mentioned that there's a science paper of maybe 15 years ago that claimed that males have greater variability in IQ or mental ability, and like they're more really smart guys and more really dumb guys. But even that, if you imagine yourself trying to measure that, like how do you measure the population and with stratified sampling to really get the frequencies right? Like finding the males with really low IQs would be very difficult because they're not walking around on the street, you know. So how do you even measure that reliably? There is a science paper that claims that males have greater variability in mental ability. Yeah, but it's a really interesting question, and there's all sorts of theoretical reasons why females should be less variable because of the number of X chromosomes and the buffering effect of the second X allele, and et cetera, et cetera. You know.
It is interesting that they don't study females because they are too variable, and then males, you know, do better because they are more variable. So, you know, it seems that as if the theory, you know, first you draw where you want to hit, and then you use the theory for what you want. But also in our rats, we never see more variability in one sex. So when we look at behavior.